Welcome back. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa has withdrawn the latest changes that he signed off on, and this with regard to the Ministerial Handbook, pending a review. Now, the decision comes in the wake of a public outcry at amendments which were effectively made to ensure that ministers and deputy ministers do not pay for water and electricity for state-owned houses in which they reside. Opposition parties also joined the fray, with the Democratic Alliance threatening to mobilise society to march against the presidency and announcing that it has laid a complaint with the Office of the Public Protector. Now, the presidency says that there was nothing nefarious about the president approving the amendments, but that he was simply trying to assist the office bearers manage their costs. So for more on this, we're joined by Advocate Stefanie Fick, who's Executive Director of Accountability Division at Organisation Undoing Tax Abuse, Outcry. Advocate Fick, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So, firstly, let me just gauge Outcry's reaction to the latest developments around the Ministerial Handbook.
I think for a moment there was a sort of, this is a move in the right direction, because this, there was such a public outcry against these, let's call it perks for ministers who's already earning an enormous amount of money. And if you start digesting, where the country is, we said from the start that I don't think objectively there's a problem with perks. It's in private sector, we see it in government, there's certain perks. But I think if you consider where we are in South Africa, this was just, I think, a slap in South Africans' faces. We are facing an unemployment crisis. We complain about load shedding. There are people that do not have electricity, that do not have access to water, and I do believe that these types of expenses can be used in other areas. So for the president to withdraw these new amendments is a step in the right direction. I do think that we need to look at the whole Ministerial Handbook, and yet again, just because of the current situation where South Africa finds itself, can we afford it? The question is, can we afford all these perks? And I do think there's so many people that will put up their hands and say, I will do it, I will pay for everything. Can I just get the salary? To a certain degree, I say that tongue in cheek. So it is a step in the right direction, but what I think we should discuss is, how did this happen? If I read the section in the Act correctly, it must be done in consultation with Parliament, and we couldn't find this consultation with Parliament. So you know what? Although I think some political parties are trying to take, try to claim victory, I think kudos to you, the journalists and civil society who decided not to keep quiet, but also Parliament. I blame Parliament. They are supposed to hold to account our executive. And why didn't they? Why did we have to, be angry and go through all of this? Where's Parliament in all of this?
And that is the million-dollar question, which also brings us back to the question of how exactly this Ministerial Handbook is decided upon. Who decides on those perks? What is the process that is undergone in order to arrive at what that final version ultimately looks like? That, coupled with the fact, as you say, Parliament needs to take some responsibility here, because these amendments were done in April. It's already October and the outcry is happening now. So were they not aware? And if they were not aware, why were they not aware?
I can only assume. So we all understand, about assume, but I can only assume. And we did a little bit of an investigation, is to try and see the committee. When did they discuss this? Because we know Parliament is actually supposed to, do public consultations. And where in Parliament was this discussed? And we couldn't find anything. And I'm going to assume, also the outcry from certain political parties parties, that it wasn't discussed in a parliamentary committee. And that is worrying. I'm not necessarily saying we don't always have to go look for nefarious reasons, but, we should follow a process. And at the end of the day, what we need to understand is that we have the fiscus, where all our expenses are paid out of. And the less money in the fiscus, the less money is available for, social well-being, for, all the things that we can all agree on is still lacking. I mean, there's such a divide in communities. And these are the type of things and expenses that we need to curb in order to make sure that the social well-being of people are lifted. So it sounds like, and I really want to reiterate, sounds like this was sort of done in secret. And I'm also, this is creating an issue where there might not be an issue, but it was apparently done in isolation, which I think, if that is the case, it should change in future. Although we are talking about, in essence, the sort of employment relationship, and what are you going to get? What is your duties? What is your obligations? What do you get out of it? We all need to remember that parliamentarians and ministers and deputy ministers are in the service of the government, who are supposed to look after South Africa's best interest, South Africans' best interest. So I think we are allowed to say the perks that you deserve, maybe it should be somehow linked to performance. Because you know what, we can't complain about service delivery because in some areas there are none. We are struggling with so many things. And that as a minister, you can claim certain benefits only if you are successful in your portfolio.
In the end, this is about accountability. And I think this is about leaders of this country being absolutely tone deaf. This is perhaps the clearest example of how the leaders of this country are completely out of step and out of touch with what people are going through on the ground. Firstly, as you point out, there should be no easy victories claimed here by anybody. To say that the president has now done an about turn on this matter is not good enough. Because why did the president, who, when he first entered office, was all about austerity, remember, when he told us that he would be cutting back on his cabinet and, trimming on some of these benefits, how does the same president then turn around and now what seems to be in secret, not only amend this to make it better, but actually add a few more things, because there's quite a few more that we haven't even spoken about, like the staff complement for ministers and, how that has been expanded upon, again, at huge costs to the fiscus and the taxpayer.
I couldn't have said it better. I think this was, for me also, a clear indication of how out of touch I think, they are with people on the ground. I mean, it's like a slap in the face. That's the only thing I can think of, that in the current climate, with so many people just struggling with basic things, you can think it's a good idea to give someone that is earning an enormous salary, to give them even more. You know what? If we were living in a country where, everything was sort of in place, service delivery was at a high, our unemployment rate was under control, we can't really complain about service delivery. We can give, our health system is to such a degree that everybody can get proper health care, that education for our kids. Every time I'm reminded, I wonder how many kids still walking to school, have to get up what time in the mornings to walk to school. Kudos to those, that we can fix that type of thing before we look at nice to haves, because this is definitely not essentials. This is nice to haves, and you can't talk about nice to haves if there are necessities in a country that is still lacking. And we will, and I think we have learned the power yet again of civil society, and thank goodness there's freedom of speech and journalism, that if we come together, that, there is power in having this type of conversations to fight for ourselves. I mean, to say that this is not right. And I mean, this was like everybody standing up together. We always, is it politicians that's creating the divide in communities in South Africa? Communities coming together to fight against this was really, really heartwarming to see that, the common enemy was less money available for the common South African.
And speaking of, claiming perhaps easy victories, so we saw yesterday, and you touched on opposition parties coming out now, pushing back against this. But one has to ask, where were they all along? Because this is not just about ministers and deputy ministers. This also includes premiers, and it includes MECs. So they are also provided for in this ministerial handbook. So I need to ask, looking at the DA's press conference yesterday, how did they not know? Because at the very least, they run the Western Cape. They have a premier in the Western Cape. Good had to know. They have a minister in that cabinet. So how come the opposition parties didn't do or say anything until the media raised the alarm?
Good question. Really good question. And you will probably not get a straight answer out of the politicians. And that's what I'm saying. The politicians, the MPs that sit in parliament. I want to know, why did it take us so long to find out? So you have an excellent point and a good question to ask. They are, they should answer to us, not us answer to them. So they are there to make sure, that things are happening according to the rules and in South Africa's best interest. But also the rest of Parliament. Once this, was out in the media and there was obviously an outcry, I'm asking each and every MP that's sitting in Parliament, why didn't they call the executive? Why didn't they call the president to order and say, but on why? Why didn't we know about it? Why wasn't there consultation with us? And what are you going to do about it? Why is it? Because someone asked me, what is civil society going to do? Why should we always, do things? It should be Parliament that is their constitutional duty is to hold the executive to account, to call on them and making sure that they do what they're supposed to do. We have just launched, our report on Parliament, and I do think we've got, there's some committees that does what they're supposed to do, but there's some other committees that need work, and it all comes down to they are South Africans' representatives, and if they are not going to hold the executive to account, we have a problem. And that's why electoral reform is so important, because ultimately we are on the road to 2024. And that's why, the politicians and everybody's trying to score points because, they are the party that is going to, save this country. Maybe so. But I do think we seriously need to consider the fact that the Electoral Act is currently before Parliament. And, what the Constitutional Court said is that we should make provision for independence to stand. So, just in a nutshell, is that communities can actually pick their representative and hold their representative to account. So that there's, that I want to say that the majority has a vote for the person that they want to see in Parliament, and that will look after their best interests.
And that, of course, is somewhere in the future. But for right now, given what has happened and how this has developed, we heard the announcement yesterday that the 2019 version of the Ministerial Handbook is now back in effect. But does this mean that everybody gets off scot-free? does this mean that the president should not be called to account for this amendment? Does it mean that Parliament itself should not be accountable, whoever should be held accountable for what has happened here? Do we just now move on?
No, I think that's why, how can we as civil society hold Parliament to account? Is to say, you need to be representative of the people. And if you're not going to do that, there is some consequences. So there is a part of me that wants to say, do we take the whole of Parliament to court? I mean, maybe that is not practically possible, but maybe by still, again, shining the light on these issues, maybe Parliament will call the president before it and ask, but what happened here? The political parties, taking account, holding the president to account, saying, how can we better the system that this doesn't happen again? Because consultation is always good. And I think Parliament is sometimes also remiss in understanding that part of their obligations is to have public participation, and not just as a tick box, not just, we had a few meetings, is to make sure that people understand what the issues are about so that they can apply their minds. Just don't feed everybody what you think they should know. Make them understand so that they can apply their mind. So what is going to be the end result? Like to, let's wait and see. But the call is, and I think the call should remain, that Parliament, this is not the time for Parliament to sit back, investigate this, and find the best way forward. Because I think then there's somewhere, it's not for us to forgive them, but I think that we will then feel that there's some type of accountability, because we are making sure this will not happen again. And may I just say, I think maybe they should look at the other perks in the Ministerial Handbook, even if this was from 2019, is to make sure that the handbook is, speaks to what our current situation looks like.
Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it for this morning. But thanks so much for your time, Advocate Stefanie Fick, Executive Director of Accountability Division at Outcry, the organization undoing tax abuse. And let us know what your thoughts are, in terms of the Ministerial Handbook, the about turn now, and reverting to the 2019 version of that Ministerial Handbook. What are your thoughts on how all of this has played out?